Okay, thanks very much. So it's great to be here. I'm wearing a lot of different hats here. So as Rob mentioned, I'm currently a faculty member in computer science at UMass as of January 5th, 24 days and counting. I'm going to be living and working in Washington as the AD for SIZE, but also, and maybe this is probably the perspective I'm bringing here. I've been a member of the SIZE Advisory Committee. And Susie mentioned this morning that there was an advisory subcommittee on mid-scale infrastructure that reported out fairly recently. Amazingly, 3 months after we did our report out, the solicitation that brought many of you here showed up. And so I'd like to think that there's some correlation between those two things. So those are sort of the hats and the perspectives that I'm bringing to the table here today. And actually, I also want to talk, there are a couple of different audiences here today too, right? There are the people, the folks that we heard from this morning who are building the infrastructure. There are other folks here who want to use the infrastructure for research purposes. So I'm a little bit worried that I'm wearing multiple hats and talking to multiple audiences, and I only have 20 minutes, plus or minus. So I hope it doesn't seem too scattershot. But here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to start and just provide you a little bit of perspective and background on, I think, one of the things that brings us here. And I'm not going to go through the SIZE mid-scale infrastructure report because it's online and the slides are online, actually pointed to in the solicitation. So I'm not going to read the report or go over, but I wanted to pull out 2 slides from that report out in particular because I think they speak to things that are important for everybody who's here. I then want to make some just high-level observations, and then when I was talking to Darlene and others about what to speak about here, they said, oh, well, you're a networking researcher. What would you like to do with this research infrastructure? And so I've got a couple of thoughts on there, although I think I'm going to be busy for the next 3 years. But I'll give you some of my down-in-the-weeds observations. Okay, so this is just one slide of background on the Midscale Infrastructure Committee. So this was charged by Farnham Jahanian back in 2012, and we basically got 4 charges. Answer these 4 questions. How should NSF go out and understand what the infrastructure requirements are from the community? Many of you, I know from looking at faces around the room here, contributed white papers as part of that process or talked to people on the phone on the advisory committee. The second bullet is, well, okay, we've got this infrastructure. How do we, NSF, you, the research community, explain to everybody else, how do you articulate the value of having this infrastructure? And I have one slide on that. I also have one slide on models for funding, something that I guess I'll worry about a lot more, but I've always worried about. And then leveraging Genie, and actually we heard a lot about that in the talks this morning. Okay, so these are just so you'll see it, the names of people on the committee. Since both Keith Marzullo and Brian Lyles are here, they were the NSF representatives, and I'm sure you recognize a lot of the other names. There were people from industry and academia involved, and again, one of the amazing things when you do workshops like this, for example, that you do a workshop and ideas start flowing around, and lo and behold, sometime after that, a program solicitation comes out. One other workshop that I worked on that actually Darlene and Mary Maeda organized back in 2002 was the Work Research Testbeds workshop that led to some of the, I mean, you guys were already underway at Utah, but some funding for that, for Orbit, for Planet Lab and others. So after we did our report out again from that, gee, a program announcement came out for that, which was really wonderful to see at some point after that. Okay, so again, I just have 2 messages maybe to take home from the Midscale Infrastructure Committee report, and then if you're interested, it's online, the report itself is online, and the slides are online, etc. The first is, understanding the value of infrastructure. Okay, so for those of you who are building infrastructure here, there's a group of people here who are involved with that. How are you going to articulate, beyond this community, what is it that's of, what is the value? So clearly doing research is the value, but we want to, for instance, have some kind of both qualitative and quantitative measures of impact. So users and use and subscription, we heard some of that already from both the presentations this morning. How big, what does it cost, things like that. But I want to focus more on that very first bullet up there, just the notion that experimental research infrastructure is important, and the notion of the kinds of discoveries that come out of it, and what there's a really nice article in 2007 or 8 by Larry Peterson and Vivek Pai about this virtuous cycle between experimentation and innovation, and sort of spiraling, and you're building things, you're studying new things, you learn new things, and that brings you back to experimentation again. So I think one thing all of us have to be thinking about is how do we articulate the value of the kind of infrastructure that we're building, whether we're an infrastructure provider or whether you're building on top of the facilities that are being provided by these two projects. Okay, the second is funding models. And I think funding models are incredibly important just because there was some talk about sustainability and maybe things crashing. So, you know, this is this first phase is relatively short-lived. What's it going to take to make a large-scale project sustainable in the long term? Okay, and I'm going to come back to this again. In particular, the notion of shared models of investments and co-investments with industry and other agencies. There was already a little bit of talk about that this morning with federation and interfaces for federation. And we'll come back to this again. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the background. Again, just to give you an idea of the setting that sort of helps set the place for the kinds of activities we're talking about today. Okay, so the first, I'm going to leave you with a couple of messages. And I always tell my students, if you remember 3 things from today's class, this is one of the things I want you to remember. So this is one of the things I want you to remember, that what you're undertaking here is incredibly, incredibly important. And I say that both to the people who are building the experimental infrastructure as well as the people who are going to be using it. Because I think that mid-scale infrastructure, and this is also addressed in the report, and the statements I'm about to make go beyond mid-scale experimental infrastructure to experimental infrastructure in general. But this group is going to be meeting a critical national need in terms of being able to perform experimental research at mid-scale. Okay, so maybe not at planetary scale with a bazillion cores and a gazillion terabytes and things of storage and things like that, but at a reasonable scale, right? And that's really important because it's something that none of us can do on our own, right? And our individual universities can't do it. So if it's going to happen nationally, it's going to happen by activities like this. And it's incredibly important for the competitiveness of the industries in the nation and pushing our science forward. So I'm going to put a little quote up here. I know some of you have seen this before, but this is for somebody who used to be in academia and now is in industry. I won't name the name, and I X'd out the institutions. So I know you may not, I'll read it since you can't maybe read it in the back. I love XXX, that was their university, and I'll miss it a lot. So this comes from a faculty member who, great graduate students, was well-funded, working on interesting things. The computer science faculty are top-notch. The students are the best the professors could ever hope to work with. It's what we all hope for, right? But there's one simple reason that I'm leaving academia. I simply love the work I'm doing at XXX. So that was a company, okay? Working on problems that are order of magnitude larger and more interesting than I can work on in any university. That's really hard to beat, okay? So, there are, let's be honest, there are certain things that you cannot do in academia that you can do in industry. But there are many things you can do in academia, and it's projects like this that help fill that gap between small-scale things we can do with local resources versus what a big XXX company can do with those kinds of resources. Research at the mid-scale is incredibly important, I think, again, from a national standpoint, being able to move the needle on systems research, to be training graduate students in experimental systems, and to be keeping great faculty members like I know are out here in academia and doing academic research. So if you take a few words out of that and Google it, it'll come up pretty quickly. Okay. It's also, if you read the Chronicle of Higher Ed, it's been talked about a lot. So, okay. So again, the message here: what you're undertaking is really, really important here. Okay. I remember the very first question that came up this morning during discussion was, "What's it going to cost me?" Okay. So that actually wasn't too surprising. So just a word about sustainability, and we're not talking about sustainability like how much energy we're using, but sustainability financially and as a long-term enterprise in experimental infrastructure, particularly at scale. And certainly one of the lessons that we saw on the Size Advisory Committee that I've seen in activities that I've been doing around Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center, for example, is that when multiple players come together, federal, state, on the government side, university, and industry, really, really great things can happen, right? And for the institutions, it's their money in the game. It's important to, I'll speak for the state of Massachusetts. Well, I won't speak for the state of Massachusetts, but for Massachusetts and our Green High Performance Computing Center, it was important for economic competitiveness to have something like that. So that was important to the state. And in that particular case, both Cisco and EMC were big players in that also. So that triumvirate of these three groups coming together allowed us to do things that none of the individuals could do, none of the individual institutions could do at any kind of scale. And I want to say that it's actually more than money, right? I mean, money is certainly important, but this allows us to, this sort of three-way partnership allows science to go forward at a larger scale, and that's going to help float all boats. It helps take research results in academia and move them into industry. That kind of translational research is incredibly important, sort of across the board. Educational opportunities, and all of those speak about this issue of national competitiveness and the importance for the country. So, what will it cost me? It's an incredibly important question, and something that I hope the models for that continue to percolate and evolve during the lifetime of this particular project. I want to say a word about sustainability and testbed architecture, and this is something that I was talking with Rob about at the break here. And I guess I want to make the point. I'm not sure it's right, but I'll make the point anyway, and maybe it will open this up for discussion. That when you have an architecture for a testbed, there's some kind of either explicit or implicit embedded sustainability model in it, because there's got to be an answer: who pays, right? So is it a government agency that pays? And there you might say, well, okay, so all the resources come in, they come in from government agencies, and then they all go out. Or maybe there was a talk about the federated interfaces for the two infrastructures we heard about today. So there's a center model where resources are centrally owned and managed. There's a federal model where there was talk today. Matter of fact, several of the questions at the 11 o'clock session address this. So I'm going to bring resources into the system. That would seem to be a great thing. I mean, it is a great thing, right? And if you bring in resources, what does that mean in terms of, you've got more skin in the game? What does that mean when you want to schedule your experiments? How is that done? You probably have some kind of localized control over your resources, and when you're not using them, then they're available to the larger federation. But I'll say that, and I think that's available, I know that's available in Emulab and I think in Chameleon also. But that kind of model then, already implicit in that, is a more federated model rather than all of our resources are coming in to this one central site and we're giving them out. So this two-sided marketplace is an idea that we've been kicking around in Massachusetts, this notion that a testbed is nothing more than a marketplace. And people bring their hardware, they bring their software, it's in a marketplace, and users then how those things get used actually depend on who wants to use them, and you can imagine floating prices and things like that. I think that's probably a little bit more researchy and a little bit more farther out there, but there are large industries whose model of infrastructure, like the airplane industry, right? Engines are not owned by the people who own the jets. They sort of belong to a third party, and they're brought in, again, through this marketplace mechanism. So you could think of a test bed as being driven by a two-sided marketplace, people bringing in resources and users coming down and saying, okay, I want those resources. So just to say that there are lots of ways to think about sustainability. And again, it's maybe not something everybody thinks about, but I guess I'd exhort you to think about this during these projects, and especially as these projects go forward. And then finally, the question of testbed use, I've talked about that some already, this notion, well, do I decide resources and how they're allocated on the basis of a committee that looks at the science and then makes some judgments and says, okay, this is super meritorious, you get this? Or is it somehow prioritized algorithmically on the basis of that plus how much skin you have in the game, what resources you've contributed? So again, I think the sustainability issue is really baked right into the architecture that one talks about, or one should think about when building test beds. And maybe, I'm curious what people think about this, so it'd be nice to come back to that later. And then just a last slide on architecture. And this is probably not the time to get into this, but as a textbook writer, I love to debate these things. And I guess, just a word about architecture here. And architecture is not the wiring diagram of 100 meg or 40 gig Ethernet going from here to here. It's really about the abstractions that you export, I think, to the people above and the sort of the conceptual organization of the test bed. And I think that the architecture that you folks have is going to be critical in determining the success, right? And the example I always like to use in class is, we were talking before about the 1990s, so I'll throw in a 1990s example here. Back when, who knew whether the internet, or that's asynchronous transfer mode now, right? Everybody here knows that, right? Which were going to win out, right? And one could argue that ATM was much more functional. It could do more things for more people in terms of its specs, but somehow the internet architecture got the abstractions right, got the the service model right there. So this is just an observation that I wanted to throw out. I think the architecture of the test bed, the things that the two projects are going to be wrestling with over the next couple of years are really, really critical. Okay, and then finally, the last of my high-level observations, and then you can, the important stuff, well, not the important stuff, but the more important things I wanted to say are done here. And it was really great to see the emphasis on education and outreach that both, came up this morning in both of the presentations. That's really great. I will say, as someone who, with Mike Zink and others at UMass who participated in some of the Genie education activities and workshop and go to the GECs and things like that, that I think they've just done an absolutely outstanding job of outreach. And so a shout out to Mark and Sarah and Chip and Nikki and Vic, for none of them are here, but just my personal observation, I think they've done a really fantastic job on community building. Okay, all right, two last slides, down in the weeds comments. So for me as a researcher, what are the kinds of things that I would sort of look for and be thinking about? And I made these slides before I saw anybody's talks this morning, so it was really great. We saw a lot about data. So Chaitan's not here, but he and I were talking about this over breakfast, and neither of us had seen the slides. So it was clear that people are really thinking a lot about data, right? It's not just computation, it's data, computation, people, software. That came through loud and clear in the talks this morning, which was really great. Both talks talked about the importance of a well-instrumented infrastructure, so those that are building on top can perform the kinds of experiments that they want to, right? There were some questions all the way down at the level of, well, can you monitor energy expenditures at this level all the way down deep. So people are clearly thinking about that. Something I heard a little bit less about, I know the Utah folks have been working with WiMAX, and now I guess you have an LTE implementation, which is totally awesome, is mobility. So we've seen a lot of discussion, and I think a lot of emphasis when we talk about cloud on sort of the more central and core part of the infrastructure as opposed to the edges, and that's okay. Certainly in the mobility space, you know, the notion of using clouds to provide, distributed clouds to provide services at the edge, and, you know, little cloudlets at the edge in support of mobility and wireless is something that I think is going to be important. And I'll say that there was a workshop just a couple of weeks ago here in DC. I think Suman Banerjee was the organizer on future research infrastructure for the wireless edge, and they were really focusing a lot on LTE type of experiments, and maybe there's opportunities for ties there, probably a little bit further down the road. Okay, application use, we talked about CPS, and then finally, you know, for me, if I weren't coming to DC, the very first thing I'd be working on this infrastructure is network function virtualization. I saw a couple of slides on that, which made me feel really great. You know, and this notion, and I'd be focusing on the cloud, actually on the control plane for that rather than specific algorithms. And I think that that offers a great opportunity to the whole computer science community, right? Because it brings in the people in formal aspects of distributed systems, of programming languages, formal methods, who can now, within the control plane for you know, for an SDN type network, apply their research ideas. So even though I won't be doing it, that's what I would have been doing in an alternate universe. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Again, just some observations on the activities that you all are undertaking here, which are really excellent, and, you know, the background in terms of where this came from. And look at the background, really does, somebody mentioned expectations, and NSF, I think Susie mentioned NSF expectations. It's really hopes, you know, what do we all hope come out of this? And I think you'll find some of that in the Midscale report, some high-level observations. Those are sort of the take-home messages that I hope maybe still percolate around in your head for a couple of days. And then, you know, my personal in-the-weeds observations, I mean, that's just me and my research interests, but was asked to say a few words about that, so I wanted to put that in. Okay, last, so since I was involved in the Midscale infrastructure advisory committee, I've seen this sort of from the very beginning to now, and it's been a relatively short period of time, 2 years, but you know, a lot of you are coming into this relatively new, but really the number of NSFers who put in, you know, vision and time and effort into making this happen is just amazing. So, you know, Farnham and Keith and Brian and Darlene, and just even conceiving of this in the first place, and then many people, once the initial concepts were out there and we were starting to have the advisory committee meetings, to start fleshing that out, to actually writing the call that you folks responded to. I mean, it's just an amazing group of people in a relatively short period of time, moving from sort of a pretty visionary concept and sort of understanding the importance of mid-scale infrastructure, like I was talking about, all the way to, you know, here it is, it's out, it's awarded. I guess it's up and running as of spring, right? Or up and running now, or up and running as of spring. So it's been a pretty amazing trip, and I think we all owe a great shout out to all of the NSFers here for all the effort that they've put in really making this happen. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about. I wanted to leave a couple of minutes if anybody had comments or questions.
Yeah, we have time for a couple questions.
Oh, nothing controversial enough. Who wants to talk about sustainability? Great. Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to make a comment on sustainability, Glenn? Or
I think your triangle model is exactly right. In all of those players, because no one of them carry forward by themselves. I think that
Right, so the comment that the industry side in particular, but so great, there's the you know, the three-way partnership, but industry, both sort of the incumbent players as well as the startups. Let me say, this morning, listening to the talks, it was really great to see how engaged, in particular, providers are in both of the activities here. So it's clear that partnership is already formed.
And if not,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, thank you.